All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating and maybe even a little unsettling. We're talking geopolitics today, specifically China's control over water resources in Tibet. You sent in a ton of research on this, a whole stack of articles and reports.
Definitely a hot topic, and one with some serious global implications.
Exactly. So Tibet, you hear it called the third pole sometimes. Why is that? Why is this region so crucial when it comes to water?
Well, picture this. Tibet, high up on the Himalayan plateau. Think of it as like a giant water tower.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Yeah, so you've got major rivers starting there, right? The Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Indus, all originating in Tibet. And they flow out, carrying, well, life to India, Bangladesh, Vietnam. So many countries depend on those rivers.
It's wild to think about. One of the sources you sent mentioned over 700 billion cubic meters of water flowing out to Tibet every year.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
It is, and I did a little back-of-the-napkin math. Nearly half of that, like 300 billion cubic meters, ends up flowing into India.
Yeah, those rivers are absolutely vital to India. So you can start to see why the control of that water, where it flows, how much, that's where the geopolitics come in.
Control the source, control everything downstream.
Exactly. And that brings us to China's dam projects.
Right. We all know about the Three Gorges Dam. It's iconic, enormous. But the sources you sent, they paint a more complicated picture than just clean energy and flood control, right? What's China's official stance on all these dams they're building? And, well, do they actually walk the walk?
Officially, they say it's for economic development, flood control, clean energy, and yeah, to some extent that's true. But
There's a but there. What's the other side of the story?
well, there are a lot of people downstream who are getting pretty worried about the impacts these dams are having. Take the Mekong River, for example. There have been reports of droughts, fisheries getting hurt in Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia. They're anxious, to say the least.
It's all connected, isn't it? Like a chain reaction. Something happens upstream, everyone downstream feels it. You also sent some stuff about India and Bangladesh. They depend heavily on the Brahmaputra, right? Are they seeing similar issues?
Very similar concerns, yeah. India and Bangladesh are both worried about water shortages and what these dams might be doing to the environment. And then you add in this layer of, well, the Mekong River Commission, the MRC.
The MRC, right. An organization supposed to be all about managing the Mekong collaboratively, right?
In theory, yes. It's meant to encourage cooperation. But China, they're not a full member, just a dialogue partner. And they often hold back on key information.
Interesting. So they share some data, but not everything. Seems strategic. Which brings me to a term that kept popping up in the research. Hydro-Hegemony. What does that even mean? Is that a fair way to describe what China is doing?
It's a tricky concept. There are two sides to it, actually, that are presented in the sources you sent. One argument is that China is acting as what they call a negative hydro-hegemon.
Negative hydro-hegemon. Okay, break that down for me.
So basically the idea is they're using their control over these rivers, especially through the dams, as a way to pressure other countries, exert control.
Yeah, I can see why that would worry people. What's the other side of the argument?
The other view is that China could be seen as a positive hydro-hegemon, that they're actually promoting cooperation on water issues in the region.
But on their own terms, right? Kind of like they're calling the shots, even if they're framing it as cooperation.
Exactly. It's a nuanced situation. And there's this Chinese idiom, benefiting from the gifts of nature.
Oh, I saw that mentioned somewhere. How does that connect to all of this?
Well, it reflects China's viewpoint that because these rivers originate in their territory, it's their right, their natural right to control them.
That's interesting, especially because the research also pointed out that China hasn't been very keen on signing international water treaties. Doesn't that lean more towards the negative hydro-hegemony idea?
It does lend weight to that side of the argument, yeah? And that's what makes this whole issue so fascinating. It's not just about the environment. It's deeply tied to geopolitics.
Definitely not your average water cooler talk. Can you give us a specific example that illustrates the potential risks we're talking about here?
Sure. One that really stands out is the Siang River incident back in 2017.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about that. That was in India, right?
Right. So the Siang River is part of the Brahmaputra system, and it suddenly turned this murky, muddy black color. They think it was due to something happening upstream within China.
And even if it wasn't deliberate, that incident shows how quickly things can become a problem, especially when there's no formal water sharing agreement between India and China.
Absolutely. That lack of clear communication, agreed upon rules, it just breeds suspicion and makes things tense.
It's a lot to process, for sure. And I bet everyone listening is starting to feel the weight of this whole issue. But before we get too bogged down, let's shift gears a bit. What can countries downstream, those most affected by this, what can they do to protect themselves?
The research you sent actually outlines a few different approaches. First and foremost, international cooperation. Understanding the laws that govern international water use, diplomacy, open dialogue. Those are all vital.
So working together is key. But what about individual actions? Can countries take steps on their own to become less vulnerable?
Yes, absolutely. Things like better water management practices within their own borders, conservation, using water more efficiently, finding alternative sources. All of that can make a difference.
So a two-pronged approach. Collaboration with other countries and taking responsibility at home. Are there any other strategies that jumped out at you?
There are two more I found really interesting. One is the idea of creating a South Asian version of the Mekong River Commission.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A dedicated platform for those countries to work together on managing water in the region. The other one involves open source satellite data.
Oh, wow. That's cutting-edge stuff.
It is, and it's getting more powerful all the time. You can use it to monitor what's happening with Chinese dam construction, track water levels, even see potential environmental impacts. It's all about transparency.
Transparency. As someone who's all about learning, I bet you love that idea.
Knowledge is power, right?
Right. And in this case, it can help hold everyone accountable. So you've covered a lot, from the mountains of Tibet to international relations and even some potential solutions. But there's one question that really stuck with me from all this research. Could climate change actually force China to be more cooperative on water issues?
That is the million-dollar question, and one we'll dig into much deeper in the next part of our deep dive. It really is the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And a tough one to answer. Because as climate change gets worse, that need for water security, it just gets more urgent for every country involved, even China.
Yeah, it makes you think about that saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But in this case, it's more like the thing that could wipe us all out, it could wipe you out too. So maybe we should, work together.
Right. Climate change doesn't care about borders. We're already seeing the effects across Asia. More crazy weather events, glaciers melting faster, rain patterns changing, all impacting how much water there is.
And it's not just quantity either. Quality is a big deal too.
Huge. Pollution, contamination. That's only going to get worse with climate change.
Yeah.
Which makes cooperation even more important.
Absolutely. And this brings to mind something you hear a lot about, hydrodiplomacy.
Yeah, hydrodiplomacy. It's basically using water as a tool, not to fight, but to build trust, to work out disagreements, get countries collaborating.
So instead of being a source of tension, water could actually be like a bridge between countries.
That's the hope.
It's a nice thought. But how do we go from where we are now with all this mistrust to actually getting along?
That's the challenge, isn't it? It's going to take a lot, both from governments and the everyday people.
Okay, so break that down for me. What needs to happen at the government level?
Well, we need clear agreements on sharing data, early warning systems, so everyone's prepared if there's a drought or a flood. And we have to figure out how to manage these river basins jointly.
Makes sense. What about the everyday people part? What can regular folks like us actually do?
This is where it gets really exciting. There are tons of citizen scientists out there, researchers, activists. They're using technology, organizing on a local level, all to push for transparency and hold governments accountable.
Can you give us some examples of what that looks like in action?
Sure. Think about remote sensing, using satellites to take images. People are using that to track things like dam construction, deforestation, how the water flow is changing. They then make that information public so governments can't hide what they're doing.
Wow, it's like citizen-led intelligence. Are there other ways people are getting involved?
Tons. You've got groups working on conservation projects, educational initiatives, even cultural exchanges focused on shared water resources. It's all about building relationships, that feeling that we're all responsible for taking care of these ecosystems.
Taking diplomacy into your own hands? Love it. As someone who's all about learning, I bet you'd be into that kind of thing.
Definitely. There are so many ways to contribute, supporting organizations that are doing this work, getting involved in those citizen science projects, even just staying informed and talking to people about it.
Spreading the word. Okay, so we've talked about climate change, forcing cooperation, hydrodiplomacy, how individuals can get involved. Let's circle back to China's actions specifically. You mentioned that they have this very specific idea about their right to control the rivers.
Yeah, and it goes way back. It's rooted in history, geography, a strong sense of national sovereignty. Their stance is basically, these rivers start in our territory, so they're ours. They fall under our jurisdiction.
Interesting. Because while they might control the source, what they DO impacts everyone downstream. Do they acknowledge that impact?
That's where it gets tricky. They do recognize that more regional cooperation is needed, but they come at it from a position of power.
We'll cooperate, but on our terms. Something like that.
Yeah, they want to be seen as a leader, a responsible player on the global stage, but compromise. Not so much, especially if they think their core interests are at stake.
It's like they're trying to walk this tightrope, showing their dominance but also wanting to look good to the rest of the world.
Exactly. And that's where things like the Belt and Road Initiative come into play. All these infrastructure projects they're funding across Asia, hydropower dams included, it gives them economic clout, political sway.
But it also opens them up to criticism, especially if those projects end up harming the environment or those downstream countries.
Yep, it's a double-edged sword, gaining power but also taking on more risk. And then there's this whole factor of internal pressure, what's happening within China itself.
Oh, right. You mentioned that earlier. Expand on that a bit. What's driving that internal pressure, and how's it affecting China's approach to water?
Well, a big driver is environmental awareness. China's seen crazy economic growth over the past few decades, but it's come at a cost.
Pollution, I'm guessing, deforestation, those sorts of things.
Exactly. Pollution, deforestation, water scarcity.
Yeah.
They're huge concerns for a lot of Chinese citizens.
Makes sense. That kind of environmental damage, you see the effects in your daily life.
Absolutely. And social media has played a big role here. It's given people a platform to speak out, share information, organize protests.
Like a digital megaphone for environmentalism.
Exactly. And the government is paying attention. They're realizing they can't just ignore these concerns.
So it's not just about keeping other countries happy, it's about keeping their own people happy, too.
Right. And we're seeing some interesting policy shifts because of that. They're investing a lot in renewables, things like solar and wind. They're pushing for water conservation, cracking down on polluters.
So trying to find that balance, economic growth, without trashing the environment.
Exactly. It's a tough balancing act. They still want those big infrastructure projects, but the pressure's on to make them more sustainable, lessen the environmental impacts.
That's a huge challenge. How are they approaching that?
One way is through technology. They're putting a lot of resources into research, trying to make hydropower dams more efficient, reduce water waste, come up with new ways to purify water.
So using innovation to solve environmental problems.
Yep. And they're also stepping up international cooperation, participating in climate talks, sharing what they know about water management, working with other countries on those transboundary water issues.
Sounds like they want to be seen as a leader in sustainable development.
Exactly. They want that image of being a responsible global power. And they're starting to realize that being environmentally sustainable is key to that image.
Okay, so we've got this internal pressure within China, driving changes, tech innovation, more international cooperation. But we can't forget the whole geopolitical context. How other countries view China's actions on water, that matters too.
Totally. Their rivals, especially India and the U.S., they're watching every move. And they're quick to call out anything that looks like China's trying to weaponize water.
It's all about perception, isn't it? And how you counter that perception.
Yep. And this is what makes it so interesting. Because China's not just trying to secure water for themselves, they're also making a statement. They want to project power, build influence, shape things in the region.
It's a high-stakes game. And the environment, the economy, geopolitics, it's all tangled up together.
Exactly. And there's no clear winner or loser here. What happens next depends on so many things. How bad climate change gets, what new technologies come out, how diplomatic talks go, what everyday citizens do.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Internal pressure within China, the geopolitical side of things. But before we wrap up this part, I want to bring it back to you and that question we posed earlier. Could climate change actually force China to cooperate more on water?
It's the question looming over everything, isn't it? On one hand, as climate change hits harder, cooperation seems more and more urgent. Like if we don't work together, we all lose.
Right, we're all in the same boat, so we better figure out how to share.
Exactly. But on the other hand, climate change could also make things worse. As water becomes more scarce, the temptation is there to hoard it, to use it as leverage.
So it could push countries together or drive them further apart.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole issue so fascinating, so important. The choices that China and all these other countries make in the next few years, they're going to have a huge impact on the future of Asia and the whole world.
Okay, so more questions than answers. But that's kind of the point of a deep dive, right? We've explored the complexities, the different viewpoints, the possibility of both cooperation and conflict. I think the biggest takeaway for everyone listening is this: stay engaged.
Couldn't agree more. This is going to affect billions of people in the years to come. Stay informed, question everything, and demand action from those in power.
And remember, even little things can make a difference. Supporting organizations doing this work, saving water in our daily lives, even just talking to friends and family about it, we can all contribute to a better, more sustainable water future.
Well said.
But before we sign off completely, there's one more big piece to this deep dive. We're going to zoom out a bit and explore this idea of conflict over water. Are we really headed for water wars, or is that overblown?
The question everyone wants answered. Tune in next time as we unpack that. We'll look at history, potential flashpoints, and whether there's a more peaceful path forward.
So, are water wars a real threat, or is that, just hype?
Water wars. It's a catchy phrase, definitely gets your attention. And some folks use it to paint a pretty scary picture of the future. But I think it's important to be careful about how we talk about this. We need nuance, not sweeping statements.
Have there actually been wars fought over water, in history?
That's the million-dollar question. And you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. Some experts will say, yes, water has been the main reason for war in some cases. Others will say, no, it's always more complicated than that.
So it's rarely just country A attacked country B to steal their water.
Right. There are usually other things going on. Fights over land, political rivalries, economic interests. It all gets mixed up together.
Okay, so maybe water isn't the only cause of war, but it can definitely make things worse, right? Especially with the climate change and water becoming more scarce.
Absolutely. Water stress can really add fuel to the fire. It creates tension, new points of conflict, and makes it harder to find peaceful solutions.
Let's talk about some of those potential flashpoints. Where are we most likely to see water-related conflicts in Asia?
Well, a few places come to mind. The Mekong River Basin, for sure. You've got multiple countries sharing that river, and China's influence upstream keeps growing. We're already seeing tensions there with those droughts downstream, the problems with fisheries. A lot of fingers point at China's dams for that.
And it's not just about how MUCH water there is. Pollution's a big issue, too.
Huge. And it's only getting worse. Industrial pollution, agricultural runoff, sewage, it's contaminating rivers and groundwater all over Asia.
Okay, so the Mekong's one to watch. Anywhere else?
The Brahmaputra River Basin. China, India, and Bangladesh all share that one. And there's no formal water sharing agreement between China and India. Plus, China's got more dams planned. It's creating a lot of mistrust downstream.
Yeah, we talked about the Xiang River incident. Even if it wasn't intentional, it shows how quickly things can escalate when there's no clear communication or transparency.
Exactly. And then you've got the Indus River Basin. India and Pakistan have been clashing over that one for decades. There's a treaty, the Indus Waters Treaty. This mostly held things together, but...
But it's not a sure thing.
Right. Climate change, growing populations, everyone needing more water. It could all put a lot of strain on that treaty and spark new conflicts.
So we've got these three major river basins, the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, and the Indus, each one with its own set of challenges. It's kind of a bleak picture. Is war over water really inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. There are reasons to be both worried and hopeful. On the pessimistic side, well, we've got climate change. That's not going away. Populations are growing. Demand for water is going up. It's going to make it harder to share peacefully.
Okay, that's the bad news. What about the good news? What gives us hope?
Well, for one thing, there's a growing recognition that cooperation is the only sensible way to manage water. Countries are starting to realize that fighting over it benefits no one.
Right. If we all need water, we're better off figuring out how to share it.
Exactly. Another reason for hope, we've already got some structures in place to help. Treaties like the Indus Waters Treaty, organizations like the Mekong River Commission, international laws about water.
So we're not starting from scratch. We've got tools we can use.
Right. And then there's technology. New ways of doing things. Water-efficient agriculture, turning seawater into fresh water, harvesting rainwater, recycling water. That can all help ease the pressure.
So it's not just about dividing up the water we already have. It's about getting smarter about how we use it, finding new sources.
Exactly. And lastly, don't underestimate the power of people. Public awareness. As more people learn about water scarcity, about the possibility of conflict, they can start demanding better from their leaders, supporting those groups, working for peace and sustainability.
So it's not just up to the politicians, it's up to all of us.
Absolutely. The future of water in Asia, it's not set in stone. The choices we make today will determine what happens. Staying informed, getting involved, being part of the solution. That's how we create a better future.
Well, this has been quite the journey. We've covered a lot, from the mountains of Tibet to the complexities of global politics and the very real possibility of conflict over water. I'm sure you've got a lot to think about, but more than anything, I hope you feel empowered.
Me too. Knowledge is power, and you've gained a lot of it today.
And remember, you don't have to be an expert to make a difference. Just stay curious, keep learning, and use your voice to advocate for a more sustainable and peaceful future. That's it for our deep dive into China's control over Tibetan water resources. Thanks for listening.